Florida. Good morning, Congresswoman.
Good morning. Great to be with you.
Thank you. Donald Trump also released a statement yesterday describing Castro's legacy as one of firing squad's theft, unimaginable suffering. I realize, as a Democratic Congresswoman, President Obama, that's your guy. Donald, not so much your guy. But as someone who represents South Florida, where there are so many Cuban Americans, whose statement do you really prefer?
Well, I prefer my own statement, the one that I put out following Fidel Castro's death, essentially underscoring that the Cuban people will benefit at least from putting behind them Fidel Castro's personal tyranny. Unfortunately, they still are ruled by his brother, the dictator Raul Castro. And what this really is, Stephanie, is an opportunity for the Cuban people to have an opportunity to have human rights reform and to be able to engage in free and fair elections, to be able to elect their own people, to not have to worry about being oppressed for expressing their opinion or being imprisoned. And so what the United States' role should be is to be a catalyst, especially now that we do have more of a relationship with them than we did before, to be a catalyst for insisting on human rights reform, particularly if the relationship is going to advance. But frankly, what concerns me is that Donald Trump has business entanglements in Cuba. And so this is another example, a prime example, of how his business entanglements and being aware of what's going on with his business and not having a blind trust and not being separated from his business is going to potentially impact his decision-making as it relates to Cuba. I mean, what happens if the people in Cuba who he does business with, who most definitely are tied to the government because everything in Cuba is tied to the government related to business and everything else. What happens when the government presses the Trump administration that his business is not going to be able to continue to make the profit or advance in the way that the Trump companies expect it to? Well, how do we know that that's not going to affect Donald Trump's decisions as president? Well, we don't, and that's why it's a huge problem.
We don't, and President-elect Trump has said to us he will separate things. Now, that remains to be seen. But in terms of policy, back in 2014, you were not so positive. You were not a proponent of President Obama's policy changes as it related to Cuba. You said that they were unearned changes. Do you think...
Right, and I still feel that way. I still feel that way. I believe a relationship with the United States should be earned. But we need to, looking forward, make sure that through this opportunity, an opening that we have now with the death of Fidel Castro, that the United States engage in a way that helps press the Cuban regime, which is still engaging in oppression, still engaging in imprisoning political prisoners, for imprisoning people for expressing their opinion. Just in the wake of Castro's death, the people who demonstrate, the women who demonstrate, the ladies in white, every Monday were asked, basically told, not to demonstrate yesterday in the wake of Castro's death. We have an opportunity here to press Cuba for more human rights reform because they've engaged in none, even since the thawing of our relationship.
Congresswoman, I want to stay on the idea of expressing one's opinion through voting, and I want to get your thoughts on Jill Stein's recount effort.
Well, you know, making anything we can do to make sure that there is more confidence than currently exists in the wake of this election, particularly since Wisconsin, Pennsylvania, Michigan are all states where the margin has narrowed and essentially is razor thin. You know, the Jill Stein campaign has made a decision to pursue a recount. They apparently intend to pay for it. Hillary Clinton's campaign, rightfully so, wants to be represented by counsel in order to make sure the recount moves forward properly, and that's a legal and perfectly acceptable avenue to pursue. And if it gives more confidence to the outcome, then that's a good thing.
Let's talk about what the DNC needs to do. Turn the page. Howard Dean wants the job. Keith Ellison wants the job. You said last week you're not necessarily going to weigh in on that, but you did say you believe the DNC chair should be a full-time position. If that's the case,
no.
Excuse me, then.
That's not what I said. What I said is that there is a and I'm not going to weigh in on who should be chair. But what I said was that there is a difference when the DNC members are choosing who to elect as chair between when the party has the White House and the infrastructure and the presidency behind them and the role of the DNC chair versus when we do not. And so I believe that there are many DNC members that will feel more strongly about the role being full-time as in, I mean, I certainly did the job full-time. I did it more than full-time. But the definition that I think the DNC members will look for is someone who only has that job. Now, some of them may not, and there'll be a campaign that will ensue. But the bottom line is that the DNC chair needs to be in a strong position to be able to press the administration, push back, be the minority voice. Because, you know, while Donald Trump has said that he intends to drain the so-called swamp, he's in the process of siphoning the swamp into the White House. I mean, between the hiring of Steve Bannon, between the nomination of candidates like Nikki Haley with no foreign policy experience to be United Nations ambassador, you know, an education secretary who has no education experience, and on top of that, her sole mission in life has been to dismantle the public schools. The DNC chair is going to have a lot on their hands.
All right. Well, thank you so much for joining me this morning, Congresswoman. I appreciate it.
My pleasure.
Coming up.